Hi, I'm Karen. We're here at Montavilla Sewing Center, and today we're going to look at the blind hem. Now, most Janome machines make the blind hem the same way, so if you have a Janome machine that is not this particular model, this will still apply. We're using the 3160 today. So we're going to use the blind hem stitch number 13. So we go over here, make sure the cursors are under here, and go to 3 on that one. I can move the cursor to the left, so it's just on the tens column, go up 1, and we're right there to 13. Notice it calls for the foot G. That's going to be this foot here. So we take the foot off and put the other foot on. I like to hold the feet front and back. It's a little bit easier to see what I'm doing. Also, it keeps my fingers away from the needle. For safety purposes, you might want to turn off your machine when you're changing your foot or your needle. But I like to have the light where I can see what I'm doing. Now, on woven fabric, you're going to want to finish the edge of your fabric, and I used a zigzag, and I used foot C for that because it has these little bars here which help keep the zigzag flat on the edge of the stitch, on the edge of the fabric, so that you don't get a line of rumpled fabric there. And then I also pressed this so it's an even distance from the edge. When you do your blind hem, you want to prepare your fabric this way. Then fold this up so you have a generous 1/4 inch or scant 3/8 inch. Then we want to use our pins, pin this next to the seam line, but a little bit away from the edge. The pins are there to keep the fabric from shifting, because now we have 3 layers of fabric. So I'm using stitch number 13. You can also use 14, which is supposed to be for stretchy fabrics. But I like 13 better for both woven and stretch. And the reason is that because here we have every now and then you have like a jog stitch which will go into this edge of the fabric here. Well, those jog stitches are going to allow the stitch to stretch. And I found that for most knits that's sufficient. Also, when you're pinning, and especially if your pin's this way, I like to bury my points a little bit. Kind of helps prevent me from getting poked that way. Okay, so there are various adjustments that you can make here. You can increase your stitch width, and you can also increase your stitch length. But let's just go with the generic and see what that does. The first stitch is going to go into the edge of that fabric, that little edge, that little folded edge, and then it's going to go over to the side and make its locking stitch. Now you need to keep this folded edge, the one that you folded to form that flange, right next to the, I'll point with my needle here, right here, right next to this here. Make sure it doesn't get away. Make sure it also doesn't drift under or bubble up against it. It should just barely touch that little black piece of metal there. And then actually that's where you want to be watching rather than up here. Now with thin fabric like this, see, I could leave that pin up there like that because it's away from the foot, but with thin fabric like this, it's almost impossible to make a truly blind hem. Blind hem is one that you can't see the stitches on the other side. If you had a thicker fabric like microfiber fleece, or a which I've used quite successfully with this stitch, or a wool blend, has a little more thickness to it, and that way the stitches kind of catch the back of the fabric and you don't see it on the front at all. But I have contrast thread to what we're stitching so you can see what's happening here. So I'm going to keep stitching this for a while here, and I've kind of got it on a slower speed. That's the advantage of having your speed slider. You can get a little more control that way. So I'm going to go needle down so I can turn this and lift this up. And there are my stitches right there. And actually that looks pretty good. Now, even if I had matching fabric to thread, it would still probably show a little bit. But if this was a printed fabric, the print would hide those little dots there. And this, of course, once you iron it, it all turns out really nice. Now, if we had a wider stitch, I'm going to show you this. Sometimes with a thicker fabric, you may need to widen your stitch. So we'd go over to the stitch width here. widen that a little bit more. I'm going to lift my needle up. Here we go. And what that's going to do is take a bigger bite into the fabric. So I'm going to go stitch down here a little bit further. And again, remember, I'm watching right here to keep that folded edge right next to that. Needle down so that when I lift the presser foot, I'm not shifting my fabric. And in this case, you can see that the stitches look a little bit more prominent. They're catching a little bit more of that fabric. So we can actually make this a little bit less. I'm going to go back to default. There we are. Go over here, make it a little bit less. And in this case, it's really fine and really close. And I think that this might not even catch that edge. We'll just have to see how that works. Also, you can make your stitches longer. Let's go like this. And that would make those jog stitches further apart. But I don't usually like to do that just because when you do that and you're putting on a sleeve, you can actually accidentally get your finger caught in one of those. So I usually like to leave them at the default setting, which is pretty close together. Generous 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so on the other side, see how it actually skipped some stitches, or almost skipped some stitches there. So for this weight of fabric, I would just go ahead and leave it at default. So there, that's default for width and length. So this is how you make a blind hem. Make sure you finish your edge first, and when you're all done, go ahead and press that with your iron. You should have a nice, flat, beautiful stitch. Now for some of your machines for doing a blind hem, you have a foot that looks like this. It's still called G, but it looks a little bit different than the one that has the fixed black guide. This one, you can actually adjust this guide, which is really useful for sewing thicker or thinner fabrics. You can also move your needle to the side, one side or the other. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put this foot on here. Lift it up a little higher, let it back down. There we go. And the slit for putting the thread is right here on the side. So we put that under there like that. Then we go ahead and choose blind hem. So here's our fabric. We turn it up this way. I like to pin it down just to make sure that it stays put. Also, keep in mind we want to have a flange out here of about a generous 1/4 inch, or like a scant 3/8 of an inch. And then we're going to put this right here so that the white guide is right next to that fold. So this is going to start with a locking stitch on the side. Looks like we got that over too far, so I can tell right now it's going to be too big of a bite. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and stitch a few stitches and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, take my needle out of the way. Right now it's got huge big stitches that it's making, so we know our guide is allowing the fabric to come too far this way. So we're going to move this guide over to the left by turning the little thumb screw there. Put it back down, try it again. This is one of those situations where you want to try it on your fabric, because fabrics are really different. Some are thick, some are thin, some bend easily, some are kind of stiff like this fabric. So try it out on a piece of fabric until you get the right settings, and then go to your project. So let's start there. Looks like we're a little bit better now. Taking smaller bites into the fabric, that's good. But I think I could move it over to the left just a little bit more. Try that again. Now notice how I have my pins. They are parallel. That way I'm not sewing over the pins. I don't have to remove them, and they can continue holding the fabric layers in place while I'm stitching. Now if I wanted to do a back stitch at the end, or a locking stitch at the end, I want to wait till my locking stitch is going to be on that flange piece and not into the fold of fabric. So I'll go needle up, next stitch is going to be on the flange, now I do my locking stitch. And what happened there is it's finished the stitch cycle, and then it went to stitching the locking stitch on the end. There we go. Take this off. and it makes a nice blind hem. Of course, we would normally use matching thread and fabric, but for demo purposes, that's why we did it this way. Also, notice that I finished that raw edge. That's important when you are sewing a garment. Anything that you have that's going to fray, you want to finish that nicely. If this video was helpful to you, give us a thumbs up, and if you have any comments or questions, you can leave them in the area below. Make sure and stay tuned for some of our other videos. Thanks for watching today. Bye.